To begin, let's start at the end. Erich Maria Remarque is one of the most famous novelists of the 20th century. Much of his life was shaped by the First World War. At 18, he was drafted into the Imperial German Army, underwent military training, and was sent to the Western Front. In the spring and early summer of 1916, he saw action in Flanders. During a firefight, he pulled a wounded comrade to safety, but was injured seriously enough that he spent most of the war at a military hospital back home. In the fall of 1918, he was sent back to the front, but the war ended soon after. Remarque's insights lay sleeping for much of the 1920s. Yet he kept trying to answer why so many ex-soldiers like him were so unhappy and uneasy. In a fit of inspiration and desperation, he wrote a novel called All Quiet on the Western Front. It tells the story of a group of high school friends that join the army, convinced by their elders that they will change the world. Soon enough, the ugly realities of the war destroy them. 2 years later, Remarque followed up with a sequel called The Road Back. This time, it was about the soldiers that endured war, only to face an uncertain peace and forgetting after it ended.
His protagonist, Ernst, is a school teacher before aimlessness and despair get the better of him. He and his comrades have returned home. Their families are distant, jobs are limited, and all the girls seem more interested in gangsters and black marketeers. Ernst had seen some of his comrades commit suicide or watch their home lives fall apart. He himself has begun having flashbacks to the Western Front, pursued by the ghost of an English soldier that he had killed.
Here I stand before you, one of hundreds of thousands of bankrupt men in whom the war destroyed every belief and almost every strength. Here I stand before you, and see how much more alive, how much more rooted in life you are than I. Here I stand and must now be your teacher and guide. What should I teach you? Should I tell you that in 20 years you will be dried up and crippled, maimed in your freest impulses, all pressed mercilessly into a self-made mold? Should I tell you that all learning, all culture, all science is nothing but a hideous mockery, so long as mankind makes war in the name of God and humanity, with gas, iron, explosive, and fire? What should I teach you then, you little creatures who alone have remained unspotted by the terrible years?
It is in that spirit of remembrance, reflection, connection, and respect that we come together virtually to think of how far we have come and where we want to go in this highly volatile and uncertain world. The First World War transformed our country and the world, yet it was not to be the last. It was a grueling, crushing conflict that saw its last year, 1918, to be the most decisive, laden with the Canadian and global turning points. Today, more than a century later, we tribute this chapter in our history. Our aim is not to glorify war or conflict. Rather, we honor those that entered and endured the war, suffering in mind and body, so that we could have peace. We remember not only the fallen, but those who returned irreversibly wounded, scarred, and changed. We remember, too, the wrong of forgetting. Please stand for our national anthem.
First World War was as destructive as it was transformative. It started on the 4th of August in 1914. It was caused by a combination of factors. Competition among the great powers in Europe, specifically Germany, France, and Britain, over who had the better military and imperialistic practices, violent patriotism, and huge alliances that obliged members to fight if there were reason to do so. The killing of an Austrian archduke in June of that year was that very reason. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, allied with Germany and Turkey, declared war on Serbia, which was allied with Russia, France, and Britain. While the world was now at war, its belligerents had long been itching for a fight. In the words of one chronicler, war was regarded as the supreme test of spirit, and, as such, a test of vitality, culture, and life. It was an expression of superior culture. War was an essential part of a nation's self-esteem and image. And Canada? Our country was at war because Britain, with which we were still tied and which was viewed as the mother country by many, was at war too.
Many Canadian soldiers, not yet deployed throughout 1914, believed they would go abroad and return home by Christmas. Their German counterparts thought the same thing. It would be an adventure and victory would be quick and guaranteed. At first, military strategists did not have any long-term plans or objectives. There were bizarre episodes proven by photographs of Christmas truces in 1914. The fighting temporarily stopped. Soldiers that earlier were trying to kill one another would swap items and celebrate amid the trenches and barricades with music, dancing, and partying. The war was not at all as generals expected, or as war artists had portrayed it. The first few months had seen dramatic movement and huge victories and defeats. By Christmas 1914, an unbroken line of trenches stretched from the Swiss frontier to the English Channel. Germany had made major westerly advances before stopping. All armies dug into their fortifications, draining supplies that were only supposed to have lasted until Christmas. This trench warfare, fighting over a few kilometers here and there, advancing eastward and then westward, with the casualties and the tens of thousands every few days, would become the routine.
A young soldier, Alex Parsonage, my great-great-uncle, wrote home in February 1916. The war is going on as usual. The guns are most always barking. I will sure be glad when the summer comes. Parsonage died that June during the Battle of Mont Sorel near Ypres.
In early 1915, attrition became the norm. Those that ran military strategy believed the offensive spirit was all important, and that despite setbacks and other evidence to the contrary, one breakthrough, one decisive thrust would move the stalled war machine. Victory would then come in weeks. The art of killing was perfected. At the Second Battle of Ypres, Germans used chemical weapons for the first time. Later, they initiated submarine warfare on the high seas, along with the use of snipers, flamethrowers, and mortar attacks. The Allies reciprocated. They introduced tanks at the Battle of the Somme the following year. This was the advent and acceptance by both sides of a new war, the intentional war of attrition which would swallow up millions of men. The decision had been made that only by wearing down the enemy could one win this war. Everywhere, industry was mobilized, the workforce reorganized, food rationing applied or planned, taxation readjusted. The war became an all-consuming enterprise. It became total. By 1917, the British and Canadian governments passed laws mandating conscription. On June the 11th, Canada's Prime Minister, Robert Borden, introduced the Military Service Act in the House of Commons. He declared, "We are all proud that Canada has played a splendid and notable part in this war. Is Canada content to relax her efforts in the most critical period of a war which concerns her heritage, her status, and her liberty? To the state, each citizen owes a duty of service, and the highest duty of all is the obligation to assist in defending the rights, the institutions, and the liberties of his country."
A young English soldier, Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, found himself recovering from shell shock at a hospital in May 1917. He was also a poet. This is one of the poems he wrote about the reality of this war. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or line. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gurgling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country.
1918 was the year everything changed. For starters, Russia extracted itself from the war. Having endured a string of crushing military defeats and an inability to fight against Germany's advanced armies, the country imploded. In February of the previous year, Tsar Nicholas II saw his unpopularity turn into full-out rioting and anarchy in the streets of major cities. Russia wanted to end involvement in this unpopular war and the crushing poverty. He was forced to give up his throne. On April 16th, Vladimir Lenin, leader of the far-left revolutionary Bolsheviks, returned to Russia from exile and pushed for political change. The government's caretakers chose to keep Russia in the war. Lenin's promise would be to end this involvement once and for all. The revolution must not mean that the new class rules, governs through the state machinery, but that this new class smashes that machinery, rules, governs through new machinery. In October, the old guard was ousted by those sympathetic to Lenin. They declared a new beginning. In March 1918, a peace treaty, Brest-Litovsk, formally ended Russia's involvement with Germany.
For the remaining Allied powers, Germany was now free to focus entirely on the West. It generated real panic and the possibility of a German victory. There were days throughout the spring and summer of 1918 that Paris was being hit with German shells from the front. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George wrote in his diary, "We are not strong enough to do more, and we shall not do that, unless we can prevent our army dwindling away. It is simply deluding ourselves to think that the Germans, after such a success as they've had in Italy and in France, will not continue to press us for all that we are worth. They are certain to keep on pushing, and if they do not break us now, they will break us later."
1918 was also the turn of the United States. Amid the chaos of war, America had remained isolationist and neutral, not keen on affairs outside of its hemisphere. In March 1917, Washington learned from British intelligence that Germany had made overtures to Mexico to join the war alongside Germany when the U.S. entered the war. On April 6th, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson formally signed America's declaration of war on Germany.
In early 1918, contingents of American soldiers began arriving in Europe. U.S. General John Pershing promised to his French counterparts, "At this moment, there are no questions but of fighting. Infantry, artillery, aviation, all that we have are yours. Use them as you wish. More will come, in numbers equal to requirements. The American people will be proud to take part in the greatest battle of history."
The German High Command was worried about the arrival of American reinforcements. Led by the Quartermaster General Erich von Ludendorff, the Germans hoped to deliver a blow to the Allied armies before the balance of power shifted in Europe. This series of military actions came to be called the Springtime Offensives. They began on 21st of March and did not wind down until the summer. The Germans used poison gas and high explosives, along with battle-hardened storm troops, to try and break the Allied lines. It almost worked. British armies were mauled and thousands of Allied troops were caught off guard. Germany made several key territorial advances. However, Ludendorff's broader efforts failed because ground-level circumstances kept changing. Most of all, Allied soldiers, British, French, Canadian, Australian, and eventually American, proved too resilient and determined.
Throughout the springtime offenses, Canadian forces were largely spared the casualty rate because their role had mostly been to provide logistical support. But there were exceptions. On the morning of March 30th, the Canadian Cavalry Brigade was called upon to repel German incursions outside of the strategic city of Amiens in the place of called Moriel Wood. Had Amiens been taken, it would have left open a line to Paris, forcing British and French armies far back. I knew that moment to be a supreme event in my life. I believed that if nothing were done, the retreat would continue and the war would be lost. Recalled Brigadier Jack Seeley. The Lord Strathcona's Horse Squadron, led by Lieutenant Gordon Flowerdew, led the assault.
The same German battery that had been pounding trenches opened on Flowerdew's soldiers. Witnesses saw Canadians in the smoke, charging in the face of machine gun fire. Flowerdew and his men slaughtered many Germans, wrote one chronicler. But in minutes, 70% of their own comrades were dead from rifle and machine gun fire. The enemy broke and ran. Flowerdew was on the ground with bullets in both thighs and 2 in his chest. "Carry on, boys," he shouted, and then uttered his last words. "We have won." Flowerdew was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery. By the start of April, there were more than 325,000 American soldiers in France. This would grow to 2.1 million by the summer. The German High Command knew they could not keep the gains they had made earlier in the year. General Ludendorff was briefed on how American forces were landing in hordes when they took a point in Picardy, 55 miles northeast of Paris. Within 35 minutes, the doughboys had taken the village, and then, despite grievous casualties, turned back several counterattacks. For the first time, Americans had taken offensive action in France, and succeeded. They had exhibited such enthusiasm, vigor, and reckless valor that it was a warning of what would happen when Pershing finally got his entire army into action. German victory had come before then.
It never did. On the 8th of August, Canadian and Australian troops, along with the British Fourth Army, spearheaded the Battle of Amman. The offensive was a surprise assault based on combined arms approach to war. The infantry attacked behind a creeping artillery barrage, supported by tanks, cavalry, armored cars, and tactical air power. Coordinated misinformation was spread to deceive the Germans as to troop locations. Canadian troops advanced 13 kilometers through German defenses and had to slow because of enemy reinforcements and out-of-range artillery. More than 11,800 Canadians died, almost 4,000 on August 8th alone. The bodies of the men and horses were strewn all about, mangled in every possible manner, reflected Private C.J. Cate.
Germany still had 2.5 million soldiers. Its defenses, the Hindenburg Line and conquered territories, remained intact. But gone was Ludendorff's will to fight. The number of German soldiers that surrendered was shocking. The German High Command called Amiens a black day, and Ludendorff admitted to Germany's leader Wilhelm II that the war could not be won. "I see that I must balance accounts," Wilhelm replied. "We are at the end of our ability to do anything. The war must end."
The First World War was not only fought among ground troops, as it was a thoroughly modern war. One of the new technological advances used by all was the aeroplane. Throughout the war, image intelligence from on high became a necessity. Pilots photographed enemy positions or terrain prior to a battle being launched. Observation balloons were used for long-distance scouting. In some areas, as in the Mediterranean, seaplanes were used for spotting and following enemy ships and supply routes over water. As the conflict progressed, aeroplanes flew over enemy cities and dropped live ordnances, bombs, in an early version of what would be used extensively in later wars. Fighter pilots in the First World War stood out because special training and vetting was involved in their selection and use. They were also glorified. Flight has always possessed an enormous symbolism for man. During the war, that symbolism was heightened, writes one historian. The air ace was the object of limitless envy among infantry, mired in mud and seemingly hopelessness. Soldiers looked up from their trenches and saw in the air a purity of combat that the ground war had lost. In the air, war still had meaning.
Clayton Knight, an American fighter pilot, remained committed throughout his life to promoting the uses of aviation in war and peace. Just before he died in 1969, he still fondly remembered the happier moments of being a fighter pilot in the First World War. War is a rotten, dirty business, started by politicians and suffered through by people like you and me. But there was something about being a flyer in those days that let you get beyond the animosity and hatred.
The most famous air fighter in the war, in terms of an unbeaten score count, was Manfred von Richthofen, often known as the Red Baron. With a flying career spanning September 1916 to April 1918, he was credited with shooting down 80 enemy aircraft. His skill led him to take on leadership of his own fighter combat wings and training new aviators. On the 20th of April 1918, he was credited with shooting down Victory 79 and 80. The very next day, on the 21st of April, Richthofen's career ended. He was leading a squad of 18 pilots over Bapaume to carry out an interception. In the air, they came across reconnaissance planes that scattered. But then, Richthofen set his sights on a Sopwith Camel, flown by an Edmontonian, Lieutenant Wilfred Wapme, who was pursuing another Fokker triplane. During the dogfight, another Sopwith, this time piloted by Captain Roy Brown from Carleton Place, Ontario, came up behind Richthofen. Richthofen's end was exactly like that of most of his victims. He had been surprised, and he was dead before he could recover from his surprise, Brown wrote later. Everything had happened so much by chance, so simply. I dove down until I was on his tail. Then I fired. The bullets tore into his elevator and mutilated the rear part of the airplane. Flames showed where the bullet struck. Richthofen kept pursuing May until both of his guns broke or jammed. Banking to the east, he likely was hit and killed by ground fire before crashing. His key mistake was that he had flown far behind enemy lines, well in range of anti-aircraft fire manned by the 24th Machine Gun Company of the 4th Australian Division. The controversy never diminished, and both Brown and the Australian ground gunners at the time were credited with the kill.
Brown never tried to make a name for himself from Richtenhoff's death. Upon witnessing his shattered corpse after the fight, he was passive. There could be no feeling of joy that there lay Richtenhoff, the greatest of all. With a feeling of shame, a kind of anger against myself moved in my thoughts that I had forced him to lay there, so calm, so peaceful, lifeless. This man who shortly before had been so full of life. The Germans were shocked, as were Allied airmen. If the greatest ace of all could be killed, then no one was safe in the war. German pilot Rudolf Stark reflected, "We whisper the dread tidings softly to one another. Our laughter dies away in the mess. The hammers are silent in the workshops. The engine that was just being given its trial stands still. A gloomy silence broods over all. A great one has gone from us."
At 72 or 75 confirmed aerial victories, depending on who was the chronicler, of the highest scoring Canadian and Commonwealth fighter pilot was Billy Bishop of Owen Sound, Ontario. Though he had become a highly skilled fighter pilot in his own right, he almost never made it into flight school. While on medical leave in London, May 1916, he befriended an influential and connected socialite that helped Bishop get into pilot training. He was trained to attack enemy reconnaissance Zeppelins, but wound up posted to the 60th Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps. There, he got acquainted with the Newport 17th Fighter aircraft. He would use it almost exclusively for his first tour of duty, while on mission on 25th of March the following year. Bishop shot down his first enemy plane, a German Albatros. After that, he tailed up 47 confirmed victories that only ended on 16th of August, when he was awarded the Victoria Cross from King George V. Bishop had been fortunate. His flying career coincided with Bloody April 1917. It was a time when the German Air Force managed to fully destroy 1/3 of the combined Allied air forces.
In a letter he wrote home to his fiancée Margaret, Bishop was aware of the risk inherent in his profession. No excitement since Thursday, June 7th, except that I had 4 fights yesterday and managed 1 beautiful red Hun. On Thursday night, we had an awful accident here. A chap named Harris went up to fly, and in diving at the aerodrome, one of his wings gradually folded up, and of course he came down. The other wing went in the same way, and he came crashing down at our feet. What an awful sight. He was killed instantaneously. We are praying for bad weather, but it never seems to come. I am so tired of this war. All I want is you and our home.
What had earned his Victoria Cross also made Bishop controversial. He would often carry out solo attacks over enemy territory, authorized by sympathetic flight commanders. His attack on a German airfield early on the morning of June 2nd, his shooting down of 3 Albatros fighters in the process, emphasized that many of his victories were never verified by witness. It left Bishop wrongingly vulnerable to charges that he falsely inflated his record. New research and access to German records have mostly validated Bishop's victories, showing that other wartime bases have uncertainties in their aerial victory records as well. Bishop's 46th and 47th aerial victories on August 16th marked the end of his first tour. He spent an extended time in Canada on a speaking and publicity tour with the Canadian authorities. He returned to the front at the end of May 1918 and tallied up an additional 24 aerial victories in less than 2 months. He also became commanding officer of the 85th Squadron of the recently formed Royal Air Force. Knowing that the Canadian and British authorities were going to withdraw him from combat activities permanently, as they feared he would be killed in action, Bishop set out on one last mission on the 19th of June. He shot down 4 pull-fast reconnaissance planes and an identified 2-seater. The next day, Bishop returned to England and eventually Canada, achieving the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. In the Second World War, Bishop became an air marshal in the Royal Canadian Air Force, working in recruitment.
One of his contemporaries, Major William Douglas, reflected, "I came to see quite a lot of him, but there was something about Bishop that left one feeling that he preferred to live as he fought, in a rather brittle, hard world of his own. He was described as a lone wolf, but I do not think any of us came to know him or understand his motives well enough to be sure about that." Bishop died in September 1956. The end of his flying career was another moment in the history of 1918.
Hello, staff and students of the Drumheller Valley Secondary School. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of your Remembrance Day ceremonies. My name is Major Adam Gushaty. I'm a husband and proud father of 2 amazing children. I grew up in Drumheller and graduated from DVSS in 2002. I've been a member of the Canadian Armed Forces for 18 years, have lived in 7 different towns and cities across the country, deployed to Kuwait as part of Operation Impact, and am now a member of 1 Canadian Air Division headquarters in Winnipeg, Manitoba. My job is to provide aerospace engineering expertise to the commander of 1 Canadian Air Division and advise on the readiness and capabilities of each of our aircraft fleets that operate at home in Canada and everywhere in the world. I'd be happy to tell you more about it, as there truly is no life like it. But I am here today to talk about the tremendous sacrifices of those who served in the military long before me. Some of them more than 75 years ago during the Second World War. Maybe some of your great-grandparents served back then, or your parents or other relatives might have served more recently in Afghanistan and as part of various United Nations missions. I know, it's hard to imagine them being young, but the things they did when they were not much older than you will blow you away when you hear about their incredible courage. I'm talking about real-life Canadian heroes, like Sergeant Ernest Smoky Smith. He was the only soldier to earn Canada's highest military honor, the Victoria Cross for extreme bravery, as a private during Second World War. Smith fought off German tanks and infantry during the Italian campaign in October of 1944. After his comrades were wounded and killed, he became a one-man army, driving back 30 German soldiers and destroying a tank. Then there were Moe and Harry Hurwitz, 2 of 13 children from a Montreal Jewish family. When war broke out, the brothers felt an obligation to volunteer. Moe even turned down a tryout with the Boston Bruins, saying, "There's no time to play hockey when millions of my brothers are getting killed in Europe." Moe joined the army, becoming a member of the Canadian Grenadier Guards, a tank unit, and Harry joined the Navy. After landing in France following D-Day, Moe won the Military Medal and the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his heroism during the Battle of the Scheldt. He single-handedly rushed a German machine gun position, knocking out the enemy resistance and taking 23 prisoners. Moe was killed not long after. He was 25 years old. Harry got the terrible news while in a German prisoner of war camp. He was captured after the sinking of HMCS Athabascan, which had been torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of France. Canadian Armed Forces heroes can be found in every generation. Heroes, like Captain Nicola Goddard, for example. She was only 26 when she lost her life in Afghanistan in 2006, helping create a better future for the people of that country. She was the first female Canadian combat soldier killed in action. She died in a firefight as Taliban forces launched an assault on the city of Kandahar. It's thanks to gutsy people such as these that today we live in a strong, democratic country that guarantees our rights and freedoms. Their heroism is the reason that Canadians enjoy a high standard of living and quality of life. Not everybody earns a medal in wartime or makes the history books, but every last one of the 1.1 million soldiers, sailors, and aviators who answered the call during the Second World War, the 26,000 Canadians engaged in the Korean War, and the 40,000 more forces members who served in Afghanistan has a powerful story to tell. It is as gripping a story as anything you'll ever read. It's a story of great uncertainty, fear, and hardship, and it is one of incredible courage. Imagine being in a foreign country where you do not speak the language, hunting down the enemy knowing your foes are also hunting you. Picture yourself, a soldier walking for hours carrying a heavy backpack, drenched in rain, covered in snow, or sweating through extreme heat. You haven't bathed in weeks or eaten a meal that didn't come out of a can. At night, you dig a deep hole in the ground, a foxhole, to catch a few hours of sleep, usually interrupted by a duty watch, artillery bombardment, or enemy attack. Or you're a sailor, feeling the freezing winds and salt spray of the North Atlantic as you stand watch for enemy submarines and airplanes trying to break the vital shipping supply lines on which the Allies rely. You may be knee-deep in water that has flooded the lower decks of your ship and you haven't seen land for weeks. Now, you're an aviator in the Air Force, flying through fog, clouds, and rain in the dark of night without the benefit of radar. Enemy artillery shells rock your plane and test your courage. You don't know whether you'll make it back to the airfield or crash in enemy territory, but you have to carry on to drop your bombs on target. Veterans' stories cover the spectrum, from invigorating victories to demoralizing defeats, but they all share a common theme. Military members' determination to fight for freedom and for peace, despite the hardships and personal sacrifices, because that's what true heroes do. Can you imagine being at war, wondering whether you'll ever see home again, whether you'll ever hug your parents again, or whether you'll grow old? 45,000 Canadians who served in the Second World War didn't get that chance. They never returned from battle. Neither did more than 500 Canadians who lost their lives in the Korean War, and the 158 Canadian Armed Forces members who did not come back from Afghanistan. Another 164 Canadian Armed Forces peacekeepers have been killed while protecting vulnerable populations in unstable and dangerous regions during United Nations missions. Canada has been a leader in keeping the peace around the world, sending more than 100,000 forces members to participate in over 66 missions around the world. Peacekeepers must be trained for both war and peace, as they are caught in the middle of warring factions on both sides. Tragically, they sometimes get caught in the conflict. Even survivors carry battle scars that can last a lifetime. Many of those scars are visible, but many others are invisible. Haunting memories of their experiences may leave veterans with long-term mental and emotional wounds, what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. How can we begin to thank our veterans for their mind-boggling bravery? Young heroes who have stepped up when duty called and put their lives on the line for our freedom? That's something we must never forget. Of course, military action is not confined to foreign soil. Neither is it limited to the past. Today's Canadian Armed Forces members continue to risk our own health and safety to protect others. The enemy may be different, but our duty to defend Canada remains the same. For instance, Forces medical personnel and support staff were deployed to long-term care homes across Canada this year to help fight against COVID-19. Military personnel have also tackled devastating floods, massive forest fires, and major snowstorms in provinces from coast to coast. Others carry out life-saving search and rescue missions by air and sea. Crews respond to thousands of calls a year. No matter where we're needed, in Canada or around the globe, dedicated Canadian Armed Forces members are ready to help. We can be counted on to keep Canadians in our country safe, just as our veterans did. That's the link that ties today's Canadian military members with those who came before us. We're all part of the Canadian family, and we're all in this together. So you can see why we hold Remembrance Day and Veterans Week ceremonies every year. It's important that we never forget the high price our veterans paid for the peace and prosperity that we enjoy. Canadians have a lot to be thankful for. Let's give sincere thanks for the many great sacrifices of Canada's veterans, past and present, protecting our people, defending our freedoms, and safeguarding the values that define and unite us as Canadians. Thank you.
The 100 Days Campaign was a series of key battles on the Western Front beginning in August of 1918 that put Germany on the defense. It also showed what Canada's forces had become. They had learned many hard, casualty-marred lessons since 1914 to become the shock troops of the British Empire. Granted, Canadian soldiers had come into their own throughout the war, as at Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele, but the 100 Days would stand apart.
What had changed? By the time 1918 began, the Canadian forces had become experts in all realms of carrying out frontal offensives. Its ranks had grown to 4 divisions up from 2. Behind advancing troops was a full panoply of support services that provided a full spectrum of logistical support. Behind the front, there were as many and more men operating a supply and transport system, moving the ammunition and food forward in huge quantities to keep the machine of modern mechanized war going. It also included veterinarian and human medicine, truck and machine mechanics, bridge builders and reinforcers, and explosives specialists. By July, each of the 4 divisions of the Canadian Forces was staffed with 3,000 engineers tasked with these specialties. The training of soldiers intensified. Sergeant L. McLeod Gold of the 102nd Canadian Infantry Battalion said, "Never has our training been more severe. Every day makes it clearer that when we move, it will be to enter the bloodiest fight in which we have yet taken part."
Leadership had changed too. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch became the supreme commander of all Allied forces. He could now coordinate a unified military strategy and objective. The Canadian forces received reinforcements to the tune of 48 battalions with a total of 48,000 infantry.
They also received a Canadian as commander. Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie took on leadership of the Canadian forces in June 1917 and remained its head until the war's end. He spearheaded all these changes in their ranks and logistical support, insisting that the Corps work together, building rapport and in a spirit of codependence. Currie's decisions, based on sound military logic and principle, were the right ones, not least as he sacrificed his own interests before those of his Corps. These factors contributed to high morale among Canadian soldiers, setting them apart from their Allied co-combatants. The Canadians believed that they could do anything, that they were unbeatable. With its stress on training and learning, its high degree of coordination, and its emphasis on surprise, firepower, and mobility, the Canadian Corps was ready.
In the span of those 100 days, Canadian forces made their way eastward to Germany to the very end of the war. Starting on August 26th, the Battle of Scarpe saw them move north from Amiens and take the well-defended German trenches east of the town of Arras. The first 2 days were slow and methodical advances with a creeping brigade for support. German reinforcements kept flowing in to help stem the advance, using pillboxes to use MG08 machine guns capable of firing 500 rounds per minute. By the 28th, 2 Canadian divisions made their way 8 kilometers east, destroying all of the pillboxes. Success depended on the initiative tactics, and soldiers with extraordinary courage and a willingness to sacrifice their lives in battle. By September 2nd, all 4 Canadian divisions, helped by the British troops and artillery, smashed the enemy positions, at the cost of 5,801 Canadian casualties.
On the 1st to the 3rd of September, Canadian divisions took the Fresnay-Rouvray and the Droncourt-Quéant lines. The Corps' success in destroying the hinge of the German defense system had not only made it possible for the British Third Army to advance, the repercussions were to be felt along the whole front. Some of the toughest German fortifications and soldiers of the war had been broken, now forced to flee southeast to their position at Canal du Nord. 5,500 Canadians lost their lives in this phase of the effort. Private Earl Bolston of the Canadian Machine Gun Corps recalled, "My friend was killed in the last push, which makes it pretty lonesome for me. You never know what minute you are a dead man here. Shells burst around you that would blow up a building the size of a house."
On September 27th, the Canadian Corps targeted the Canal du Nord, fortifications that would lead them to the city of Cambrai, the enemy's key rail and road connection in northern France. They received assistance from air fighters and rear group engineers that constructed bridges so soldiers, tanks, and artillery could cross the canal. German fortifications were everywhere in the lead up to Cambrai. The fighting was intense. The Allies used Vickers machine guns, while both sides used phosgene and mustard gas to flood the battlefields.
Early on the morning of the 9th of October, German forces were caught off guard by attacking Canadians. Cambrai was liberated. Much of the city was in ruins. The German High Command could no longer supply remaining forces at the front and issued an order for general retreat. The Canadians lost another 13,620 men, killed, wounded, or captured, but had overcome 11 now retreating German divisions. Canadian pilot Warren Hendershot from southwest Ontario was among those providing air cover. "I have never in all of my life, and never do I expect to see anything to equal this morning's war. We crossed the line just as the sun was coming up. The whole front was one mass of smoke, dust, and flames. The poor boys on the ground certainly deserve great praise."
In the last stages of the 100 Days campaign, another Canadian air ace, William Barker of Dauphin, Manitoba, carried out his last air combat operation. Up to that point, his official score was 47 shot-down aircraft accumulated during his time on the Western and Italian fronts. Shortly after takeoff in a Sopwith Pup on the morning of October 27th, Barker encountered a two-seat reconnaissance plane and shot it down. Then he was attacked by a biplane and was wounded in the thigh. He dropped 2,000 feet and found himself surrounded by 15 Fokker D-7s. Barker fired at 3, was wounded in his other thigh, and briefly fainted before coming around. Despite now being shot in his left elbow, he engaged in more enemy aircraft before flying westward and crashing at a British balloon site. Though his serious wounds and recovery prevented him from receiving the Victoria Cross until March 1919, he became Canada's most highly decorated aviator. "By Jove, I was a foolish boy," he said later. "But anyhow, I taught them a lesson."
The writing was now on the wall. Germany's allies were pursuing peace deals. The Austro-Hungarians signed an armistice on November 3rd, while the Ottomans followed 1 week later. The German government was also pushing for peace. From October 10th onward, Canadian forces advanced dozens of kilometers a day, liberating French and Belgian communities from occupation, engaging in occasional firefights. The last major conflict took place at Valenciennes from October 31st to November 2nd. Curie ordered a massive shelling of defenses at Montreuil, stunning and forcing into retreat 2 German divisions. Then, the British High Command ordered Curie to take the city of Mons on November 10th. The next day, at 11 a.m., the armistice came into effect.
The last Allied casualty of the war was a Canadian. At 10:55 a.m., 5 minutes before the armistice, Private George Price of the 28th Northwest Battalion was spotted by a German sniper, who shot him in the chest. Many soldiers, knowing that the end was in sight, became highly ambivalent about carrying on fighting, for fear that they would be the last ones to be killed. At other times, death came home after the armistice. Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, the soldier and poet, was killed in action on the 4th of November during the cross of the Sambre-Oise Canal. His mother was cheerful with news of the war's end. Amid the sounds of church bells in Shrewsbury announcing the armistice, she got the telegram informing her of her son's death. The First World War ended the way the poet T.S. Eliot described in one of his poems. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper.
We had left behind the comradeship of long hours on trench post and patrols. We were entering a cold sea, facing the dark, the unknown we could not escape. So said Private Will Bird of the 42nd Canadian Infantry Battalion. After the armistice, there was little cause for remembrance. In Canada, several veterans organizations sprang up and eventually merged into the Royal Canadian Legion. However, membership remained low. Ex-soldiers were like the proverbial elephants in the room. Employers were encouraged to hire former soldiers, but many found them a poor risk. The incidence of unemployment among ex-servicemen was pitifully high. In the victor states, the masquerade was no less elaborate. They had won, yes, but what had they won? Commemorations began to become tradition, yet they were awkward for onlookers and veterans alike. The old catchwords, freedom, dignity, justice, simply rang hollow. Even arguments relating to what had been averted by the war, as opposed to what had been achieved, offered little sustenance in relation to the sacrifice. Best not to ask such questions. Commemorate? Yes. Think? No.
Wing Commander William Baker, our country's most decorated aviator, was typical of many ex-servicemen attempting to readjust to peacetime. After the war, he had spent months in recovery and physiotherapy for his injuries. He and Billy Bishop formed a business partnership headquartered in Toronto, an airplane charter, maintenance, and sales company that went under by 1922. Thereafter, he worked for the Royal Canadian Air Force until he resigned in 1926. Barker became reckless with his safety, seldom saw his parents and family in Manitoba, and at one point letting a gap of 8 years go by before visits. A teeter-totter during the war, he became a heavy drinker afterwards. Rumors of scandalous behavior were regular. His biographer writes, "The understandable lack of insight by his family and friends, the patriotic jinxism of non-combatants drove many veterans, like Barker, into rage or sulk. The feelings of alienation from society could be very powerful, and were usually alleviated only in the company of other war veterans."
Barker eventually became vice president and general manager of the Fairchild Aviation Corporation of Canada. In March 1930, he carried out a flying demonstration of one of the company's aircraft. At some point, Barker lost control during a steep maneuver. He died when the plane crashed onto the frozen Ottawa River. Arch Whitehouse, a fellow Great War ace, reflected, "There seemed to be no reason for the crash, and the best that can be said is that it ended Billy Barker's long agony." It was not a unique experience. What came after the war was often less than stellar for an entire generation.
On this Remembrance Day, wearing masks amid the COVID-19 pandemic, we remember 1918 for another reason. Beginning that spring, governments and individuals worldwide wound up having to battle again, albeit with a viral pandemic. The Spanish flu made its rounds in several waves. Though its origins remain unclear, Patient Zero was probably an American Army recruit that became infected, likely from waterfowl, and then arrived at a training depot at Camp Funston in Kansas, which trained some 20,000 soldiers to fight overseas. That spring, more than a dozen Army bases reported infections passed off as cases of seasonal colds and flu. In April, with the influx of American soldiers, the disease made it to France, spreading to French, British, Canadian, and Australian troops. They, in turn, spread it elsewhere. King George V came down with it, as did Prime Minister Lloyd George. Later that fall, President Wilson was infected. French President Georges Clemenceau's son-in-law died of the disease. There was a growing list of political and military figures that disappeared for weeks on account of Spanish flu.
Spanish flu affected the war effort. Soldiers trying to fight were laid up by the flu in such numbers that some commanders complained that the disease was hindering their ability to fight. The 29th Division of the British Army planned an attack on Lebec at the end of June, but postponed it because so many of its soldiers were sick. The German forces called the disease Flanders fever and were struck. General Ludendorff blamed influenza for sapping his already exhausted forces of the energy needed to launch his July offensive. Germany's lingering leader, Wilhelm II, also got the disease.
The pandemic petered out in July but re-emerged in a second wave, quite possibly on or close to the Western Front. Epidemiologists believe that it mutated, spreading easily with the mass movement of people and soldiers from all over Europe and the world. Chemical weapons in use, mustard gas most especially, were mutagenic, capable of inducing genetic changes in living organisms, including viruses. And those same gases had compromised the lungs of many of the young men gathered there, rendering them ripe for invasion. The flu spread in the depraved conditions of trench warfare, while civilians facing malnutrition and nutritional deficiencies found themselves especially vulnerable. That fall, the Canadian Forces ranks were withered with infection. Others received appalling letters from Canada reporting on what had happened back home.
Barrack rooms, which the day before had been full of bustle and life, would now be converted wholesale into one great sick room, the number of sick developing so rapidly that the hospitals were, within a day or two, so overfull that fresh admissions were impossible, and the remainder of the sick had to be nursed and treated where they were. 1 out of 10 sufferers of the second wave became so sick that death resulted more often than recovery. The most tragic feature was its high quota among the young. About a quarter of those stricken were children, 15 and under. The only effective remedy was quarantining. Throughout North America, citizens were encouraged or mandated to wear gauze masks, to avoid large congregations, and to use disinfectants and sprays. The infected were advised by doctors to practice complete rest. To the poor, who had to work or starve, this was impossible advice, and they continued at their jobs, passing on the dread disease to others. By the time Spanish influenza ran its course, after a third or possibly fourth wave ending in 1920, anywhere from 50 to 100 million people worldwide had died.
I stand here before you, a polluted, a guilty man, and can only implore you ever to remain as you are, never to suffer the bright light of your childhood to be misused as a blowflame of hate. About your brows still blows the breath of innocence. How then I should presume to teach you? Behind me, still pursuing, are the bloody years. How then can I venture among you? Must I not first become a man again myself? So said Ernest, the protagonist in Remarks novel that we visited earlier.
Today we remember our war dead and those who perished in a disease and pandemic made possible by the First World War. Those who forget the past are indeed condemned to repeat it. A thought worth thinking as 100 years later we remember during our current pandemic, masks and all.